Mister, please, they're going to kill my mom. They have the hammers." The words ripped through the Grand Soul banquet hall like a blade through silk. The child's voice was pure terror, the kind that makes grown men flinch and look away. Her red lace dress was pristine but wrong for this moment, a splash of innocence in a room built on blood money. The beads woven into her cornrows clicked with each frantic step as she stumbled forward, her small brown hands reaching past the security guards who'd frozen in confusion. She wasn't reaching for just anyone. She was reaching for the one man in the room who looked like he'd stopped feeling anything years ago. The classical quartet went silent. Wine glasses stopped mid-swirl. Every gangster in tailored Italian suits held their breath because this little girl hadn't just interrupted a truce negotiation. She'd invaded a war council. And the man she'd chosen to beg wasn't just feared. He was Gian, the Viper, the ice-cold architect of Soul's underworld, a man in flawless designer clothing who hadn't shown mercy in 7 years. The serpent tattooed along his neck seemed to tighten as she gripped his expensive sleeve, her fingers digging into fabric and flesh like she was drowning and he was the only solid thing left in the world. What happened next didn't just break the treaty. It shattered it so completely that by sunrise, 3 crime families would be decimated, a chairman would be dead, and everyone who survived would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand how one little girl changed everything. You need to stay until the very end because what this cold-hearted king does for a stranger will tear your soul apart and rebuild it in ways you never imagined. Before we see what Gian does next, I have a favor to ask. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, claiming nobody cares about stories like this. But I believe tales of justice deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Hit that subscribe button right now. And if you believe that real courage means standing up for the helpless even when it costs you everything, smash that like button. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let's build a community that believes in redemption. Now, let's step into the moment that changed everything. The hum of controlled conversation was nothing but a predator's purr up here. A calculated symphony where every laugh was rehearsed and every smile was a weapon. The Grand Soul Banquet Hall existed in a bubble of manufactured elegance where each breath cost someone their soul and every handshake could end an empire. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering arteries of Gangnam, but the view meant nothing to the men gathered around the mahogany table. They were here for territory, not scenery. Gian sat at the head like a king forged from winter itself. His charcoal suit was cut to perfection, unbuttoned just enough to reveal the viper that crawled up from his collarbone, its scales rendered in ink so intricate they seemed to pulse when he breathed. His dark hair was slicked back with precision, revealing a face that could have belonged to a Renaissance sculpture, beautiful, severe, and completely devoid of warmth. Gold glinted at his wrists and fingers, but it wasn't jewelry, it was armor. Everything about him radiated control. From the way he held his wine glass to the way his eyes tracked every movement in the room without ever truly engaging with anything. 7 years ago, Kang Jian was different. He'd felt things. He'd protected his younger brother, Min-Su, with the kind of devotion that made him vulnerable. Then Min-Su was murdered in a territorial dispute, dying on a rain-soaked street, while Jian held him and screamed for an ambulance that arrived too late. The man who survived that night wasn't the same man who'd taught his brother to ride a bike. This version had surgically removed every soft impulse and replaced it with calculation. He ruled the Jumga syndicate with surgical brutality, never raising his voice because his whispers were more terrifying than anyone else's threats. His silence could empty rooms. His reputation could end lives. Tonight was supposed to be routine. Chairman Kang of the rival Myeongdong faction sat across from him, fat fingers wrapped around a brandy snifter, discussing the redistribution of the hotel district's protection contracts. Jian's lieutenants murmured confirmations and adjustments, their voices hushed like they were in a temple. Jian listened without reacting, his expression a perfect mask of boredom. He'd built an empire on the principle that emotion was a liability, that sentiment was the crack where the knife always found its way through. His men feared him. His enemies calculated around him. And Soul had learned not to expect compassion from a man who'd forgotten how to offer it. The security at the Grand Soul was legendary. 18 men stationed at every access point, metal detectors disguised as decorative pillars, biometric scanners hidden in door frames, and enough concealed firepower to hold off a military incursion. Nothing entered the sovereign suite without Jian's explicit approval. Nothing until the doors burst open. It wasn't a rival crew. It wasn't a police raid. It was a 7-year-old girl in a red lace dress, her brown skin gleaming with sweat and fear, her cornrows adorned with silver beads that clicked like tiny chimes as she ran. She moved like hunted prey, all desperation and pure instinct, her small feet barely keeping purchase on the polished marble as she crashed into the center of the room. 4 of Jian's security lunged forward. Another reached for his concealed weapon. But she was already moving, her target locked with the kind of unshakable certainty that only children and the desperate possess. She threw herself at Jian, her small hands clamping onto his tattooed forearm with enough force to crease his $1,000 suit. "Mister, please," she sobbed, her voice fracturing into pieces. "They're going to kill my mom. They have the hammers, the basement kitchen. Please." The beads in her hair clicked frantically as she looked up at him with eyes so filled with terror and hope that something shifted in Jian's chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in 7 years. A sound from a different life. His hand twitched toward the child before he could stop himself, then froze midair as years of ruthless discipline warred with something older, something human, something that remembered holding his dying brother and being too late. His men stared, waiting for orders. Chairman Kang smirked, enjoying the disruption. The room held its breath, and Jian felt the ice around his heart crack just enough to let in one dangerous thought. What if he could save this one? He stood slowly, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow over the child like a dark angel. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but cut through the room like a blade. "Where?" The girl's eyes widened with desperate, fragile hope. "The basement kitchen. Chairman Kang's men. They said my mom saw something she shouldn't have. They're going to—" "Ah, the housekeeper," Chairman Kang interrupted with a wet chuckle, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. "The nosy one from the 3rd floor. An unfortunate witness to an unfortunate accident. These things resolve themselves, Jian. Surely you understand business." Jian's eyes, which had been empty moments before, suddenly focused with the intensity of a predator locking onto prey. In that crystallized moment, surrounded by wealth and violence, and calculated indifference, he made a choice that would unravel everything he'd spent 7 years building. "Get her to the car," he said quietly to his lieutenant, his hand settling on the girl's head with unexpected gentleness. "We're going to find her mother." He turned to Chairman Kang, and his smile was a razor. "And you're going to tell me exactly which of your men are in my hotel's basement. Right now." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees, and somewhere in the corner, Jian's second-in-command lifted a phone to his ear and whispered 7 words that would ignite a war. The Viper just broke the truce for a child. The girl's name was Erica, and she'd navigated 12 floors of one of Seoul's most secure hotels to reach this room. Jian discovered this as his men swept the building for breaches, finding the service elevator override 3 floors down, and the tiny footprints marked in kitchen flour leading through the service corridors. Someone had taught her to navigate complex, hostile environments. Someone brilliant and desperate. Jian knelt beside Erica in the private elevator descending to the garage, the mirrored walls reflecting a strange tableau, a monster and a child. She was trembling, her red dress perfect except for the hem, which was singed. Up close, he could see the intelligence flickering behind her terror, the way she watched him with a mix of fear and assessment that reminded him of soldiers deciding whether to trust a temporary ally. "Who taught you to find me?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been in years, a tone he'd buried with his brother. "Mama did." Erica's small hands twisted together. "She said if bad men ever came, I should find the scariest person in the building and ask them for help. She said scary people understand how dangerous the world is. Strategic thinking. Tactical awareness. This wasn't a child raised in safety. This was a child trained for survival by someone who understood how predators think." Jian's instincts, honed by decades in Seoul's underworld, began assembling a picture that made his jaw tighten. "Your mother's name? Maya Chen. She cleans the floors. But she's not just a cleaner. She sees things. She told me she saw a bad man hurt another man tonight, in the hallway near the VIP suites. And then they took her. Maya Chen. The name sparked recognition, the quiet housekeeper with the college degree who'd been working at the Grand Sol for 3 years. Always polite, always invisible. The kind of person powerful men never noticed until she became a problem. "They're in the basement." Erica nodded, then pulled something from her dress pocket with shaking fingers. It wasn't a toy or a good luck charm. It was a small piece of paper with an address written in careful handwriting, and below it, 3 words: "Trust your instincts." Jian took the paper, his trained eyes recognizing the weight of a mother's final instruction to her daughter. This wasn't panic, this was preparation. His phone buzzed. His security chief's voice was tight. "Boss, we have a problem. Chairman Kang's men are moving toward the basement service exit. They have a woman, and they're not taking her to the police." Jian's hand curled into a fist, the first genuine emotion to cross his face all evening. The elevator doors opened to the basement level. The sound of muffled screaming echoed from somewhere in the shadows, and Jian realized with perfect, terrible clarity that the moment Erica had touched his arm, the treaty was over. The Viper was awake, and someone was going to pay for making a little girl cry. The service elevator smelled like industrial cleaner and fear. Jian stood in the corner, his reflection fractured across the scratched steel walls, while Erica pressed herself against his side with one small hand clutching his jacket. His head of security, Park, stood by the controls, his finger hovering over the basement button like he was waiting for his boss to come to his senses. "Sir, if we do this, Chairman Kang will consider it an act of war. The Myeongdong faction will press the button." Jian's voice was flat, final. Park pressed it. The elevator descended with a mechanical groan that sounded too much like a death rattle. Above them, the Grand Sol banquet hall existed in crystalline perfection. Champagne bubbles catching light, string quartets playing Mozart, men in $1,000 suits discussing the price of human souls over imported oysters. Down here, the hotel showed its true skeleton. Exposed pipes dripped condensation. The walls were institutional beige, stained with years of grease and neglect. The air tasted like bleach and something metallic that made Jian's instincts scream danger. They passed the 3rd sub-level, laundry and linens, the 2nd, storage and supplies. When the elevator shuddered to a stop at B1, the basement kitchen level, Jian could already hear it, a woman's muffled screaming, cut short by the sound of impact, flesh hitting flesh. Then laughter, the kind that people make when they're enjoying someone else's pain. Jian's hand moved to the small of his back, where his Sig Sauer P-226 rested in its custom holster. Park had already drawn his weapon. But Jian raised one hand, stopping him. "Stay with the girl. If I'm not back in 5 minutes, take her to the safe house in Itaewon." "Boss, 5 minutes." Jian looked down at Erica, who was staring up at him with those impossibly trusting eyes. He knelt so they were face to face, and when he spoke, his voice was gentler than Park had ever heard it. "I'm going to get your mother, but I need you to stay here with Park. Can you do that?" Erica nodded, but her hands tightened on his jacket. "You promise you'll bring her back?" Jian had learned long ago not to make promises he couldn't keep. Promises were for people who still believed in fairness, in happy endings, in a universe that cared about innocent children and their mothers. But looking at Erica's face, he found himself saying words he hadn't spoken in 7 years. "I promise." He stood and walked into the corridor before he could take it back. The basement kitchen was a maze of industrial hellscape. Massive ovens designed to feed hundreds sat cold and dark. Prep tables stretched like surgical stations under flickering fluorescent lights. The floor was slick with something that could have been water or blood or both. Steam from the dishwashing station created a fog that turned everything into shadows and suggestions. Jian moved through it like a ghost, his expensive shoes silent on the wet concrete. He'd grown up in places like this, in the underbelly of Seoul's glittering surface, where people worked themselves to death so the rich could eat in comfort. He knew every hiding spot, every blind corner, every acoustic trick that could disguise violence. He heard them before he saw them. 4 voices, speaking in the casual tone that men use when they're doing something they've done before and expect to do again. "The bitch won't stop crying. Should I gag her?" Kang said, "Make it look accidental. Can't have gag marks." "Who's gonna check?" "She's nobody. Hotel housekeeper. They die in kitchen accidents all the time. Make sure you get the phone." Kang said she filmed something. Jian rounded the corner and stopped. The contrast was obscene. Above them, literally above their heads, crystal chandeliers worth more than these men would earn in their lifetimes cast perfect light on perfect people having perfect conversations about imperfect crimes. Down here, in the guts of the same building, 4 men in cheap suits were preparing to murder a woman tied to a prep table with electrical cord. Maya Chen was smaller than Jian expected. Thin, with her housekeeper's uniform torn at the shoulder, her face already swelling from the beating she'd taken. Her hands were bound behind her back, her legs tied to the table's steel supports. There was a gag in her mouth, but her eyes were alert, calculating, not defeated. Even now, bleeding and bound, she was watching for an opening. One of the men held a ball-peen hammer, tapping it against his palm with casual menace. Another was searching through Maya's pockets, pulling out a phone with a cracked screen. The third leaned against a commercial refrigerator, smoking a cigarette in violation of every fire code. The fourth, the one who seemed to be in charge, was checking his watch like this was just another task on his list. Kang wants this done before midnight. Make it quick. The man with the hammer stepped closer to Maya. He raised it above his head, testing the weight, choosing his target. Maya's eyes went wide. She tried to scream through the gag, a sound so primal and desperate that it echoed off the steel surfaces. "Gentlemen," Jian's voice cut through the moment like a blade through silk. All 4 men spun toward him. Their hands went to their weapons, 2 pistols, 1 knife, 1 taser. But they froze when they saw who was standing in the shadows. Everyone in Seoul's underworld knew that face, that tattoo, that reputation. The Viper didn't come to basements. The Viper sent men to basements. The Viper was supposed to be 3 floors up, signing treaties and pretending civilization existed. "Mr. Jian." The leader's voice cracked slightly. "This is Myeongdong business. Chairman Kang authorized a murder in my territory, in my hotel, of a woman whose daughter is currently upstairs telling me exactly where to find you." Jian took 3 steps forward, and the men backed up instinctively. He moved like water, smooth and inevitable. "Would you like to know what I authorize?" The man with the hammer made the mistake of raising his weapon. Jian moved. Later, Park would try to explain what he'd heard from the elevator. The sound of bodies hitting steel, the crack of bone breaking, the wet thump of flesh impacting concrete, the scream that cut off mid-breath. But he couldn't explain the silence that followed, the kind of quiet that only comes when something brutal and final has occurred. Jian emerged from the kitchen 4 minutes later, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt splattered with blood that wasn't his. He was carrying Maya Chen in his arms, her restraints cut, her face pressed against his shoulder. She was conscious but trembling, her hands clutching his shirt like Erica had clutched his jacket. Behind him, in the basement kitchen, 4 of Chairman Kang's men would need serious medical attention. If they were smart, they'd leave Seoul before they got it. Park stared at his boss, at the blood, at the woman, at the complete demolition of 7 years of careful political balance. "Sir, the consequences. Get the car." Jian's voice was steady, calm, like he'd just finished a business meeting instead of a massacre. "We're leaving through the service exit. And Park? Call the emergency number. Tell them the Viper is going to war." Erica ran forward, her small face collapsing with relief when she saw her mother. "Mama." Maya's eyes, swollen and bloodshot, found her daughter's face. Then they found Jian's, and in them was a question that had no easy answer. Why would a monster save us? Jian didn't have an answer. He just knew that when he'd walked into that kitchen and seen the hammer raised above Maya's head, something in his chest had cracked open wider. Something that felt dangerously close to the man he'd buried 7 years ago. The man who still believed that some things were worth fighting for, even if it cost him everything. Jian had learned to kill with his hands before he learned to kill with guns. In the streets of Itaewon, where he'd grown up, weapons were expensive and traceable, but fists were free, and creativity was survival. The orphanage had taught him hunger, the streets had taught him violence, and the 7 years since his brother's death had taught him that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. Until tonight, when a little girl with beaded braids had reminded him what it felt like to be helpless. The 4 men in the basement kitchen made their first mistake when they assumed Jian would pull his gun. Their hands went to their own weapons, fingers twitching toward holsters and concealed carry positions, their eyes tracking his movements with the practiced wariness of men who'd been in firefights before. They were calculating angles, considering cover, preparing for the tactical dance of armed combat. Jian reached past his gun and picked up a dinner fork from the prep table. It was heavy, commercial-grade stainless steel, the kind used in industrial kitchens where durability mattered more than elegance. 4 tines, 8 inches long, with a thick handle that fit perfectly in his palm. Jian tested the weight for half a second, his fingers adjusting to the balance, and then he moved. The man with the hammer was closest. He'd been standing over Maya with that ball-peen raised like an executioner's axe, probably imagining how he'd explain the accidental head trauma to whatever corrupt detective Chairman Kang had on payroll. He was still turning toward Jian, still processing the threat, still trying to lower the hammer and raise his other hand toward the pistol at his hip. Jian drove the fork into his shoulder with surgical precision, hitting the nerve cluster that would paralyze the entire arm. The hammer clattered to the floor. The man's scream was cut short when Jian's elbow connected with his throat, a strike calculated to cause maximum pain without crushing the trachea completely. He wanted them alive. Barely. The second man managed to draw his pistol, a compact Glock 26 that he swept toward Jian's center mass. But Jian was already moving, already inside the weapon's effective range, his body flowing like water around the threat. He caught the man's wrist and twisted, using the attacker's own momentum to drive him face first into the edge of the stainless steel prep table. Bone crunched against metal. The gun skittered across the wet floor. Jian released the man and grabbed a cleaver from the magnetic knife strip on the wall. The third man, the one who'd been smoking by the refrigerator, had enough sense to look terrified. He fumbled with his taser, trying to arm the device while backing toward the exit. But the basement kitchen was a maze of equipment and obstacles, and he backed directly into a rack of hanging pots. The metallic crash echoed through the space like thunder. Jian was on him in 3 strides. He didn't use the cleaver's edge, didn't need to. The flat of the blade crashed against the man's jaw with enough force to guarantee a concussion and several shattered teeth. The taser fell from slack fingers. The man crumpled. That left the leader. The one who'd been checking his watch like murder was just another appointment. He was smarter than his companions. He didn't try to draw a weapon. Instead, he dove behind the industrial oven, using the massive steel structure as cover, while he shouted into his radio. "We have a situation in the basement kitchen. The Viper is here." "I repeat, Jian is." Jian threw the cleaver. It wasn't a movie throw, spinning dramatically through the air. It was a straight, brutal line drive that embedded itself in the man's thigh, cutting through muscle and pinning him to the oven's gas line housing. The scream that followed was gratifying in its pure agony. The entire fight had taken 18 seconds. Jian walked calmly to where the leader was pinned, still screaming into his radio for backup that wouldn't arrive in time. He knelt down, his blood-splattered shirt making him look like some kind of demon from a nightmare, and pressed one hand over the radio to kill the transmission. "Chairman Kang sent you to kill a woman for witnessing a crime." Jian's voice was conversational, almost friendly. It was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. "What crime?" "Fuck you, I don't." Jian twisted the cleaver. The scream could probably be heard 3 floors up. Good. Let the gala guests hear what happened in the basements of their pristine hotels. Let them understand that their comfort was built on the backs of people like Maya, who could be murdered for the crime of seeing too much. "What crime?" "The minister." The man sobbed, his tough guy facade crumbling under the pain. "Minister Cho. Kang had him killed in the VIP suite. Made it look like a heart attack. But the bitch saw them carrying the body. She saw everything. She recorded it. Please, please, the phone. Just take the phone." Jian stood and walked to where one of the other men had dropped Maya's cracked phone. He picked it up carefully, pressing the power button. The screen flickered to life, showing a video file dated today, time-stamped 2 hours ago. He didn't watch it. He didn't need to. The terror in these men's eyes told him everything he needed to know about what it contained. He turned to Maya, who was watching him with a mix of terror and desperate hope. Her gag had come loose during the fight, and she was breathing hard, her chest heaving with the effort of staying conscious through the pain. Maya Chen. Jian crossed to the prep table and used the knife from the first man's belt to cut her restraints. The electrical cord fell away, leaving red marks on her wrists and ankles. Your daughter is upstairs. She's safe. Can you walk? Maya tried to stand, but her legs buckled. Jian caught her before she hit the floor, his arm supporting her weight with surprising gentleness. Up close, he could see the full extent of the damage. Split lip, blackened eye, finger-shaped bruises on her throat. She'd fought them. Of course she had. Any woman brave enough to record a murder was brave enough to fight for her life. My phone, Maya whispered, her voice hoarse. They can't have my phone. I have it. Jian held it up so she could see. This evidence is it worth dying for? Maya's eyes, even swollen and bloodshot, blazed with something fierce and unbreakable. My daughter's worth dying for, but I'd rather live and make these bastards pay. For the first time in 7 years, Jian smiled. It was small, barely a crack in his frozen mask, but it was real. I think we can arrange that. Behind them, one of Kang's men was crawling toward the exit, leaving a trail of blood and broken teeth. Jian didn't bother stopping him. Let him run. Let him tell Chairman Kang exactly what happened when you tried to murder innocents in the Viper's territory. Let the entire Myeongdong faction understand that the treaty was dead and Jian was done playing civilized. Kang's men think women like Maya are disposable trash. If you can't stand people who abuse their power to hurt the weak, subscribe right now and comment "Justice for Maya." Only bullies will skip this. He scooped Maya into his arms, cradling her like she weighed nothing. She tensed at first, probably not used to being touched with anything resembling care, but exhaustion and pain won out. Her head fell against his shoulder. Why are you helping us? She whispered. You're the Viper. You don't help people. Jian carried her toward the elevator where Park and Erica were waiting. He could see Erica's small face pressed against the elevator's window, her hands flat against the glass, her entire body trembling with the effort of staying where she'd been told to stay. I don't know, Jian admitted. And it was true. He didn't know why a desperate child's grip had shattered 7 years of careful emotional control. Didn't know why seeing Maya tied to that table had ignited something he thought he'd buried with his brother. Didn't know why, for the first time since Minsu died, he felt like he was doing something that actually mattered. But as he carried Maya toward her daughter, as he saw Erica's face transform from terror to joy, he realized something terrifying. He wanted to know. He wanted to understand why protecting these two strangers felt more important than the empire he'd built, the reputation he'd cultivated, the carefully constructed armor he'd worn for 7 years, and that curiosity, that crack in his frozen heart, was going to change everything. The service elevator groaned upward with the sound of protesting metal, a noise that seemed too loud in the suffocating silence. Maya was barely conscious, her head lolling against Jian's chest while her fingers clutched his blood-soaked shirt. Erica pressed against his other side, her small hand gripping his belt like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Park stood by the controls, his weapon drawn, his eyes flicking between his boss and the floor indicator, with the expression of a man watching a carefully constructed empire collapse in real time. Sir, we should take the basement exit. Straight to the parking garage. The lobby will be exposed, Jian finished. Which means Kang's men won't expect us to use it. They'll have the basement covered by now. They'll have everything covered by now. Then we move fast. The elevator shuddered to a stop at the ground floor. Through the brushed steel doors, Jian could hear the ambient noise of the Grand Sol's lobby, the fountain in the center of the atrium, the muted conversations of late-night guests, the click of expensive shoes on imported marble. It sounded almost normal, almost peaceful. Park positioned himself in front of Jian, his Glock raised in a two-handed grip. On 3, 1, the doors opened to chaos. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth, all soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers and marble columns that cost more than most people's homes. 20-foot windows looked out onto Gangnam's neon skyline. Designer furniture clustered in conversation areas where the rich discussed their portfolios over $30 cocktails. The front desk gleamed with polished brass and practiced smiles. And scattered throughout this temple of elegance were a dozen men who very clearly didn't belong. They wore cheap suits that didn't quite fit, They positioned themselves poorly, too clustered, too obvious. Their eyes swept the space with the mechanical vigilance of hired muscle who'd been told to watch for something specific. Chairman Kang had called in reinforcements, and they'd flooded the hotel like rats abandoning a sinking ship, except these rats had come to start the fire. Jian counted them in the split second before they noticed him. 12 men, 3 by the main entrance, 4 near the bar, 2 flanking the front desk, 3 more by the fountain. All armed, judging by the telltale bulges under their jackets. All waiting. The first one spotted Jian and his eyes went wide. He reached for his weapon while shouting something in Korean that roughly translated to, there, the Viper. Time compressed into something viscous and slow. Jian saw the man's hand disappear inside his jacket. Saw the other thugs turn like a school of predatory fish sensing blood. Saw the hotel guests, the innocent civilians in designer clothes who'd come here expecting safety, begin to register that something was very, very wrong. Park, get them to the car. Jian's voice was preternaturally calm. He shifted Maya in his arms, transferring her weight to Park with the kind of smooth efficiency that comes from years of tactical training. Then he knelt and looked directly at Erica. Listen to me very carefully. When I say run, you run. You hold Mr. Park's hand, and you don't let go, and you don't look back. Understand? Erica's eyes were huge, her small face frozen in terror. But I'll be right behind you, I promise. It was the second promise he'd made tonight. Jian had spent 7 years not making promises, because promises were for people who still believed the universe cared about keeping them. But looking at Erica's face, he found himself meaning it with an intensity that surprised him. Run. Park moved first, his body forming a human shield around Maya and Erica as he sprinted toward the main entrance. The hotel's automatic doors were 30 meters away. The armored Mercedes was parked at the curb just beyond. 30 meters, 10 seconds at full sprint, an eternity under fire. The first shot came from one of Kang's men by the fountain. It went wide, punching through a decorative vase that exploded in a shower of porcelain and orchids. The sound was deafening in the marble atrium, a crack that echoed off every hard surface and sent the civilian guests into screaming panic. Jian drew his Sig Sauer and returned fire in one fluid motion. He didn't aim to kill shots too many civilians, too much chaos. Instead, he targeted knees and shoulders, places that would drop a man without the risk of through-and-through shots hitting bystanders. His first bullet caught a thug in the thigh. His second shattered another's collarbone. The lobby erupted into warfare. Kang's men opened fire with the desperate, sloppy shooting of criminals who'd been given guns but not training. Bullets tore through furniture and walls. Mirrors shattered into crystalline rain. A chandelier took a hit and crashed to the marble floor with the sound of 1,000 breaking promises. Guests threw themselves behind columns and couches, their screams adding to the cacophony. Jian moved through it like a ghost, using the architecture as cover. A marble column stopped 3 rounds meant for his chest. He returned fire around the edge, dropping another of Kang's men. The fountain's decorative stonework absorbed a burst from someone's submachine gun. Jian vaulted over a leather couch, his expensive shoes skidding on marble made slick with spilled champagne and blood. He could see Park ahead, still moving, still protecting Maya and Erica. The little girl was running as fast as her small legs could carry her, her red dress a splash of color against the chaos. But Kang's men were closing in, forming a loose perimeter between Park and the exit. One of them raised a pistol, aiming not at Park but at the small red figure beside him. Jian's heart stopped. He was too far away. The angle was wrong. He couldn't make the shot without risking hitting civilians. But the thug's finger was tightening on the trigger, and Erica was 3 seconds away from having her small body torn apart by 9mm rounds. Jian did the only thing he could do. He ran directly into the line of fire. His body hit Erica's a fraction of a second before the shots came. He felt the impact in his shoulder, a white-hot spike of agony that traveled down his arm and turned his fingers numb. His expensive suit jacket, Italian wool, custom-tailored, worth more than that thug made in a month, tore apart as the bullet exited through the fabric. Blood bloomed across the charcoal gray like a grotesque flower. They hit the marble hard. Jian's body curled around Erica's, absorbing the impact. He could feel her heart hammering against his chest, could hear her screaming his name, could smell the fear sweat and cheap fabric softener from her dress. Park was there instantly, returning fire with brutal efficiency. 3 shots, 3 bodies dropping. The path to the door cleared like magic, like the universe had finally decided to give them a break. Move. Park hauled Jian to his feet, one arm supporting his boss while the other kept his weapon trained on the lobby. Maya was already stumbling toward the exit, her survival instincts overriding her injuries. Erica clung to Jian's uninjured arm, her beads clicking frantically. They burst through the automatic doors into the Seoul night. The Mercedes sat at the curb like a steel sanctuary, its armored plating glinting under the streetlights. Park's driver had the engine running, the back door already open. Get in, get in. Maya dove into the back seat, pulling Erica after her. Park shoved Jian in next, then threw himself into the front passenger seat. Drive, now. The Mercedes peeled away from the curb with a screech of expensive tires on the pavement. Behind them, Kang's men poured out of the hotel lobby, weapons raised, muzzle flashes lighting up the entrance like deadly fireflies. Bullets sparked off the armored body. The rear window bulletproof glass worth more than a small car spiderwebbed but held. The driver took a corner at 70 kilometers per hour, the Mercedes' suspension absorbing the turn with Germanic precision. Jian pressed his hand to his shoulder, feeling a hot blood pulse between his fingers. The bullet had gone through clean, missing bone but tearing through muscle. He'd had worse. He'd survive. He looked at Erica, who was staring at him with eyes so wide and terrified that something cracked in his chest all over again. "You're bleeding," she whispered. "I'm fine. You got shot because of me." Jian reached out with his uninjured hand and very gently wiped a tear from her cheek. His fingers came away wet. "I got shot because bad men tried to hurt you. There's a difference." Behind them, the Grand Seoul Hotel receded into the distance, its perfect facade now marred by bullet holes and shattered glass. Sirens wailed in the distance. Seoul's underworld would be buzzing with the news within minutes. The Viper had broken the treaty, killed Kang's men, and started a war. All for a little girl in a red dress and her mother who'd witnessed too much. Jian leaned back against the leather seat, his ruined suit jacket soaking blood into the expensive upholstery, and realized with perfect, terrible clarity that there was no going back. The man he'd been died in that lobby, and he had no idea who he was becoming. The Mercedes tore through Gangnam's neon-lit streets like a missile, weaving between late-night traffic with the kind of precision that comes from having a driver who'd done evasion training in the military. Jian pressed a wad of cloth someone's jacket. He didn't care whose against his bleeding shoulder while his free hand pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked from the lobby firefight, spiderwebbed with fractures that made the contacts list difficult to read, but it still worked. He scrolled to Minho's name and pressed call. Minho Park had been Jian's second in command for 4 years. They'd grown up 3 blocks apart in Itaewon, had run the same streets, and had fought the same fights. When Jian had risen to power after his brother's death, Minho had been there, loyal and steady and reliable. He managed the Gumga Syndicate's eastern territories, handled negotiations with the Chinese importers, and kept the younger members in line. Jian had trusted him with his life 100 times. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Pick up," Jian muttered, watching the Seoul skyline blur past the bulletproof windows. Behind them, somewhere in the maze of streets and overpasses, Kang's men would be mobilizing. Every thug, enforcer, and hired gun in the Myeongdong faction would have Jian's description by now. They needed backup. They needed safe houses. They needed the full weight of the Gumga Syndicate to create a protective perimeter. 4 rings. 5. "He's not answering?" Park asked from the front seat, his eyes scanning the road for tails. "Give him a second. He might be..." The call went to voicemail. Minho's voice, recorded and cheerful, invited Jian to leave a message. Jian hung up and immediately called again. This time it rang only once before going to voicemail. Someone had declined the call. A cold weight settled in Jian's stomach, the kind of dread that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with certainty. He pulled up his contacts again and called Jung, his third in command, the enforcer who ran the southern districts. Jung answered on the first ring. "Boss, what the fuck is happening? I'm getting calls that you shot up the Grand Seoul. That you killed Kang's men. Where's Minho? Silence on the other end. Not the comfortable silence of someone thinking, but the loaded silence of someone who knows something they don't want to say. Jung, where is Minho? Boss, I don't know how to tell you this. Jung's voice was tight, carefully controlled. About an hour ago, Minho called a meeting. All the lieutenants. He said you'd given orders to consolidate operations, that we needed to restructure command. He showed up with a dozen men I'd never seen before. When I asked questions, when I said I needed to confirm with you directly, he told me I was either with him or against him. Jian's hand tightened on the phone hard enough to make the cracked screen dig into his palm. And I'm calling you from a bathroom in Hongdae, because I told him to go fuck himself and barely got out alive. Boss, Minho's staging a coup. He's got half the middle management convinced you've gone crazy, that you're throwing away everything we built for some housekeeper and her kid. He's offering promotions, territory, and money. And he's offering it with Kang's backing. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Jian could feel Maya and Erica watching him from the back seat, could sense their growing terror as they realized the protection they'd hoped for was crumbling in real time. Park had gone rigid in the front seat, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. How long has he been planning this? Jian's voice was deadly calm, the kind of quiet that preceded violence. I don't know. But boss, the way he moved tonight, the infrastructure he had ready, this wasn't opportunistic. This was prepared. He was waiting for you to give him an excuse. And Jian had given him the perfect one. By choosing to save Maya and Erica, by breaking the treaty with Chairman Kang, by prioritizing strangers over strategy, Jian had handed Minho a gift-wrapped justification for betrayal. He could already hear the narrative Minho would sell to the other lieutenants. The Viper has gone soft. The Viper is compromised. The Viper is leading us to war over a woman and child who mean nothing to our interests. How many are still loyal? Jian asked. Jung's hesitation told him everything he needed to know. Me. Maybe 6 others. The rest are either with Minho or waiting to see which way this goes. Boss, you need to understand what you did tonight. It doesn't make sense to them. These men respect strength, strategy, cold calculation. You just threw away a multi-million-dollar treaty and started a war with the Myeongdong faction to save civilians. They think you've lost your edge. And what do you think? Another pause. Then, quietly, I think the man who saved my sister from a trafficking ring 7 years ago is still in there somewhere, and that man is worth following into hell. Jian felt something tighten in his chest, a sensation he'd almost forgotten gratitude. Get somewhere safe. Don't trust anyone. I'll contact you when I can. He hung up and immediately tried another number. Then another. Out of 12 key lieutenants in the Guomga syndicate, 7 didn't answer. 3 calls went directly to voicemail, the phones already turned off. Only Jung and 2 others confirmed their loyalty, and they were scattered across Seoul with bounties on their heads. Minho had moved fast, surgical, efficient, exactly the way Jian had trained him. We're alone, Park said quietly from the front seat. It wasn't a question. We're alone, Jian confirmed. Maya's voice came from the back seat, hoarse and brittle. I'm sorry. This is because of us. If we hadn't... Don't. Jian cut her off, his tone sharp enough to make her flinch. Then softer. This was coming. Minho didn't betray me tonight. He was already gone. I just didn't see it. He should have seen it. The signs had been there. Minho's increasing questions about Jian's decisions. His suggestions that they could expand faster if they were more flexible with their rules. His comments about how sentiment was bad for business. Jian had dismissed them as ambition, the natural restlessness of a capable lieutenant waiting for more responsibility. But it hadn't been my ambition. It had been contemptuous. Minho had looked at Jian's carefully controlled empire and seen weakness in the discipline, vulnerability in the structure. He'd wanted something more savage, more profitable, more willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for power. And Chairman Kang had offered him exactly that. There is nothing worse than a traitor. If you have zero respect for backstabbing snakes like Minho who sell out their friends for money, hit that like button. Let's prove loyalty still exists. Where do we go? The driver asked, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The safe houses will be compromised. Minho knows all of them. Jian's mind raced through possibilities, calculating and discarding options with the speed of a man who'd spent 7 years preparing for every contingency except this one. The penthouse in Gangnam Minho had the codes. The warehouse in Incheon Minho had keys. The apartment in Itaewon where Jian sometimes went to think Minho knew about it. Every bolt hole, every sanctuary, every carefully prepared escape route had been shared with the man who was now hunting him. Boss? Park turned in his seat. And for the first time in the 4 years he'd worked for Jian, there was uncertainty in his eyes. Erica spoke up, her small voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "We can go to my grandma's." Everyone turned to look at her. She was pressed against her mother's side, her red dress torn and dirty, her beaded braids disheveled, but her eyes were clear and focused. "Your grandma's?" Jian repeated. Maya's hand tightened on her daughter's shoulder. "My mother lives in Suwon, a small apartment. She's elderly, and she doesn't know about your work," Jian finished, understanding immediately. "Which means Kang's men don't know about her. Which means Minho doesn't know about her." Maya nodded slowly. "It's not much, just 2 bedrooms. But it's outside Seoul, and no one would think to look there. It was perfect precisely because it was imperfect. Not a safe house but a home. Not a fortress but a refuge. The kind of place that wouldn't appear in any of the Gumga Syndicate's files because it had nothing to do with crime or territory or power. Just a grandmother's apartment where a housekeeper's daughter sometimes visited. "Suwon," Jian told the driver. "Take the back roads. No highways. Change routes every 10 minutes." As the Mercedes altered course, heading south toward the smaller city beyond Seoul's borders, Jian leaned back against the seat and let the reality of his situation sink in. His empire was in flames. His most trusted lieutenant had betrayed him. Half his organization was hunting him. Chairman Kang wanted him dead, and he was bleeding from a gunshot wound while protecting 2 civilians who had no business being anywhere near his world. 7 years of careful construction, demolished in 4 hours. And the worst part? He didn't regret it. Looking at Erica's small face, seeing the trust in her eyes despite everything, feeling Maya's quiet strength radiating from beside him, he'd do it all again. Every choice, every consequence. Minho had called it weakness. Jian was starting to think it might be the first real strength he'd shown in 7 years. The apartment in Suwon was everything Jian's penthouse wasn't. Small, cluttered, warm. The walls were covered in faded floral wallpaper that had probably been installed in the 90s and never updated. Family photos hung in mismatched frames. Maya as a child, Erica's school pictures, an elderly couple on their wedding day. The furniture was old but clean, the kind that had been maintained with care because replacing it wasn't an option. It smelled like ginger tea and laundry detergent, and something baking that made Jian's stomach clench with a hunger he didn't recognize as physical. Maya's mother, Mrs. Chen, was a tiny woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. She'd taken one look at her daughter's battered face, her granddaughter's torn dress, and the bleeding gangster in her doorway, and simply stepped aside. "The bathroom is the second door on the left. The first aid kit is under the sink. I'll make tea." No questions, no panic, just the calm competence of someone who'd survived worse and knew that hysteria helped no one. Now Jian sat on the edge of the bathtub while Park cleaned and dressed his shoulder wound with the efficiency of someone who'd done field medicine before. The bullet had passed through cleanly, missing bone and major arteries, but the pain was constant and sharp. Every movement sent fire down his arm. "You need a real doctor," Park muttered, wrapping gauze around Jian's shoulder with practiced hands. "This could get infected. You could lose mobility in the arm if the muscle damage is worse than it looks." "Later," Jian's voice was tight with pain. "Right now we need to figure out our next move. Our next move is survival. Minho has the organization. Kang has the Myeongdong faction. We have 6 loyal men, 1 armored car, and whatever weapons we're carrying. The math isn't good, boss." Jian knew Park was right. In any rational calculation, they were already dead. They should be planning escape routes out of Korea, new identities, a life somewhere far away from Seoul's underworld. But rationality had stopped applying the moment Erica grabbed his arm and looked at him with those trusting eyes. "I'm not running," Jian said quietly. Park's hand stilled on the bandage. Boss, Kang has evidence of murdering a government minister. Maya's phone has the video. If we can get that to the right people, the police will have to move against him. And if Kang falls, Minho loses his backing. That's assuming the police aren't already bought. Assuming the video is admissible. Assuming we survive long enough to deliver it. Park tied off the gauze with more force than necessary. You're betting everything on a lot of assumptions. Do you have a better plan? Park was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. The sound of a man who knew he was following his boss into a suicide mission and was going to do it anyway. No, I don't. A small knock interrupted them. Erica stood in the doorway, her red dress replaced with pajamas that were too big for her, probably something Maya had packed for visits. Her cornrows were still perfect, the beads catching the bathroom light, but her face was scrubbed clean of tear tracks. Grandma says you should come eat. She made soup. Jian started to stand, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. Erica watched him struggle for a moment, then stepped forward with the kind of fearless determination that only children possess. You're hurt because you saved me, she said matter-of-factly. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're bleeding through the bandage. She pointed at the red spot seeping through the white gauze. And you look scary. Like the bad men in movies. Jian glanced at himself in the bathroom mirror. She wasn't wrong. His shirt was ruined, his hair was disheveled, and his face wore the cold, dead expression that had earned him his reputation. The viper tattoo crawling up his neck seemed more pronounced in the harsh bathroom light, its scales rendered in such detail that they appeared to move with each breath. I'm sorry, he said, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. For looking scary? For being what he was? For dragging her into his world? I can fix it, Erica announced. Before Jian could ask what she meant, she'd climbed onto the closed toilet seat to reach his height and pulled a small elastic band from her pocket. Hold still. Her small fingers combed through a section of his hair near his temple, separating out a thin strand with the careful precision of someone who'd done this before. Jian froze, not from fear but from the sheer unexpectedness of the gesture. No one touched him, ever. His men kept their distance. His enemies kept further distance. Physical contact was something that happened during violence or sex, never tenderness. But Erica's fingers were gentle as she divided his hair into 3 parts and began braiding with the unconscious skill of a child who'd watched her mother do this 1,000 times. Mama braids my hair when I'm scared, she explained, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. She says it helps organize your thoughts, makes the chaos into something neat. I figure if it works for being scared, maybe it works for looking scary too. Park had frozen by the sink, his expression caught somewhere between shock and something that might have been tenderness. Jian could see his own reflection in the mirror. The Viper, Seoul's most feared crime boss, sitting perfectly still, while a 7-year-old girl braided a tiny section of his hair. It should have looked ridiculous. It should have undermined every ounce of his carefully cultivated reputation. Instead, it felt like something cracking open inside his chest. Some frozen thing beginning to thaw. There. Erica secured the braid with her elastic and stepped back to admire her work. Now you look less like a monster, and more like a person who just happens to have a scary tattoo. Thank you, Jian said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. They moved to the small dining room where Mrs. Chen had set out bowls of xiaoliongtang, the milky beef bone soup steaming and fragrant. Maya sat at the table, her face cleaned and bandaged, wearing her mother's clothes. She looked smaller without her housekeeper's uniform, more vulnerable, but her eyes were alert and calculating. She watched as Jian sat down carefully, favoring his injured shoulder. Watched as Erica immediately claimed the seat beside him, chattering about how her grandmother made the best soup in all of Korea. Watched as this man, this notorious criminal, listened to her daughter with genuine attention, nodding at appropriate moments, even offering a small smile when Erica described her school's upcoming talent show. I know who you are, Maya said quietly, when Erica had gone to help her grandmother in the kitchen. I've seen you on the news. The Viper, head of the Gumga Syndicate. They say you're responsible for at least 20 murders, that you rule Gangnam through fear, that you haven't shown mercy in 7 years. Jian met her eyes steadily. All of that is true, and yet you saved us. You got shot protecting my daughter. You started a war with one of Seoul's most powerful crime families because a little girl asked you to help. Maya's voice was soft but fierce. Why? It was the same question Jian had been asking himself since the moment Erica grabbed his arm. Why had he abandoned the treaty? Why had he risked his empire? Why had he chosen two strangers over everything he'd spent 7 years building? I don't know, he admitted. 7 years ago, my younger brother was killed. He was dying in my arms and I couldn't save him. I couldn't do anything but watch him bleed out on the street. And something in me died with him. I decided that caring about people was a weakness, that attachment was a liability, that the only way to survive was to stop feeling. He paused, looking down at his soup, seeing his distorted reflection in the broth. But then your daughter looked at me with the same desperation I must have had that night, and I realized I had a choice. I could be the person who looked away and stayed safe, or I could be the person who tried to save someone, even if it cost me everything. You chose us over your empire, Maya said. It wasn't a question. I chose to be someone my brother would have been proud of. Jian's hand unconsciously touched the small braid in his hair. Even if it's only for one night. Maya was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand over his uninjured one. Her palm was calloused from years of cleaning work, her fingers scarred from industrial chemicals and hard labor. My daughter has good instincts about people, she said softly. When she was 4, a man tried to grab her at the park. Before I could react, she bit his hand and ran straight to a police officer. She knew who to trust. And tonight, in a room full of criminals and killers, she trusted you. She might have chosen wrong. No. Maya's grip tightened. She chose the man who kept his promise. Twice. You said you'd save me, and you did. You said you'd protect her, and you took a bullet. In my experience, that's the definition of choosing right. Erica returned with a bowl of rice, completely oblivious to the weight of the conversation she'd interrupted. She settled back beside Jian and pointed at his braid with obvious pride. See, Mama? I told you it would help. He looks way less scary now. Mrs. Chen shuffled in with tea, her ancient eyes moving between Jian and her family with the wisdom of someone who'd lived through wars and poverty and loss. Eat, she commanded. Whatever storm is coming, it's easier to face on a full stomach. So they ate. This strange, impossible group, a crime boss, his bodyguard, a housekeeper, her daughter, and an elderly woman sharing soup in a tiny apartment while Seoul's underworld hunted them. And for the first time in 7 years, Jian didn't feel alone. The attack came at 3 a.m, during that dead hour when even cities like Seoul seemed to exhale and rest. Jian had been dozing in the armchair by the window, his Sig Sauer resting on his lap, his injured shoulder throbbing with each heartbeat. Park had taken the first watch from the bedroom, positioned where he could see both the apartment door and the fire escape. Maya and Erica were sleeping in Mrs. Chen's bedroom, curled together under a patchwork quilt that smelled like mothballs and safety. Jian should have known the peace wouldn't last. The first indication something was wrong came from the street below, a car engine cutting off too abruptly, followed by the distinctive sound of car doors closing with careful silence. Not the casual slam of residents coming home, but the controlled quiet of professionals trying not to alert their target. Jian was on his feet instantly, pain forgotten, weapon raised. He moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. 4 men were exiting a black SUV, and they moved with the coordinated precision of trained operatives. Not Kang's street thugs, not even Minho's usual enforcers. These were mercenaries, the kind who got paid in cash and didn't ask questions. Park, Jian called quietly. We have company. Park emerged from the bedroom, his Glock already in hand. He took one look at Jian's face and understood immediately. How many? 4 outside, probably more coming. Jian's mind raced through scenarios. Minho tracked us somehow. The car? Disabled the GPS before we left Seoul. Park moved to the other window, checking sightlines. The phone, Maya's phone. If Kang's tech people pulled the data before we took it, they'd have her mother's address in the contact list. Jian cursed himself for not thinking of it sooner. Of course they'd track the phone. Of course Minho would think of every angle. Jian had trained him too well. A sound from the stairwell footsteps. Multiple sets, trying and failing to be silent on the old wooden steps. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a 4-story building. No easy escape routes. No back exits. Just a fire escape that would leave them exposed and vulnerable. "Wake them," Jian ordered. "Get everyone into the bathroom. It's the only room without exterior walls." Park moved fast, disappearing into the bedroom. Jian heard Maya's sharp intake of breath, Erica's confused murmur, Mrs. Chen's calm acknowledgement. Good. The old woman had lived through the Korean War. She understood that sometimes survival meant following orders without question. Jian positioned himself behind the kitchen counter, using the solid wood as cover. He checked his magazine, 12 rounds left. Park had maybe 15. Against 4 or more trained mercenaries, the math wasn't favorable. But math had stopped mattering the moment he'd decided to save Erica. The apartment door exploded inward. Not a subtle lock-picking. Not even a battering ram. They'd used a breaching charge. A small explosive that blew the door off its hinges and sent it crashing into the living room. The sound was deafening in the small space. A percussion that made Jian's ears ring. 2 mercenaries came through the smoke. Their movements textbook perfect, one high, one low, covering different angles. They wore tactical gear and balaclavas, carried suppressed submachine guns, and moved like they'd done this 100 times before. Jian fired twice. The first mercenary went down with a bullet in his throat. The second dove behind the couch, returning fire with controlled bursts that chewed through the kitchen counter's wood facing. Splinters exploded into the air. Park emerged from the hallway, firing from a kneeling position. His shots were precise, measured, each one aimed to kill. A third mercenary who'd been coming through the door jerked backward, his chest blooming red. But there were more. Jian could hear boots on the stairs, voices communicating in clipped Korean. Minho hadn't sent 4 men. He'd sent an entire team. A flashbang came through the destroyed doorway, bouncing once on the wooden floor before detonating. Even with his eyes closed and his hands over his ears, Jian felt the concussive force and the blinding light that seemed to burn through his eyelids. His world became ringing silence and phantom colors. He fired blind, sweeping his weapon in the direction of the door, trying to suppress the entry point. Heard someone curse in pain, a hit, but probably not a kill. His vision was starting to clear, the world returning in fragmented pieces. A mercenary was right there, materializing from the smoke like a demon. Too close for Jian to bring his weapon around. The man's knife was already moving, a tactical blade aimed at Jian's throat with the precision of someone who'd killed this way before. Jian twisted, taking the blade in his already injured shoulder instead of his neck. White-hot agony exploded through his body, so intense that his vision grayed at the edges. He felt the knife grind against bone, felt hot blood soaking through his bandages. But pain was just information. Jian had learned that lesson in the streets of Itaewon, had refined it through 7 years of building an empire on violence. He trapped the mercenary's knife hand against his shoulder, using his own impaled flesh as a prison, and fired his Sig Sauer point-blank into the man's stomach. The mercenary folded, his weight pulling the knife free as he fell. Jian stumbled, his shoulder screaming, blood running down his arm in sheets. The room spun. Too much blood loss. Too much damage. His body was starting to shut down the non-essential systems, prioritizing survival over consciousness. Another mercenary came through the door, weapon raised, aiming not at Jian but toward the hallway, toward the bathroom where Maya and Erica were hiding. Park was pinned down behind the overturned dining table, taking fire from at least 2 directions. He couldn't get a clear shot. Jian tried to raise his weapon, but his arm wouldn't cooperate, the damaged muscles refusing to obey. The mercenary's finger tightened on the trigger, and Erica screamed. It wasn't a scream of terror. It was a scream of pure rage. A sound so unexpected and so primal that everyone in the apartment froze for half a heartbeat. She'd emerged from the bathroom despite Maya's attempts to hold her back, her small body silhouetted in the hallway, and she was screaming at the man who was about to murder them all. "Leave us alone! Leave us alone! You're bad! You're evil! I hate you!" The mercenary turned, confused, his weapon swinging toward this tiny, unexpected threat. In that moment of distraction, That half-second of hesitation as his brain processed the impossibility of a child in this battlefield. Jian moved. His body was running on pure adrenaline now. Every movement, agony, every breath, fire. He crossed the distance that separated them, his wounded shoulder useless but his left hand still functional. He grabbed the mercenary's weapon, forcing the barrel toward the ceiling as it discharged, sending suppressed rounds into Mrs. Chen's ceiling plaster. They struggled, the mercenary trying to shake off this wounded, bleeding man who wouldn't die. But Jian had grown up fighting for his life in alleys where losing meant death. He'd spent 7 years proving that ruthlessness could overcome any physical disadvantage, and he'd made 2 promises to a little girl whose screams were still echoing in his ears. He brought his forehead down on the mercenary's nose with enough force to shatter cartilage. Used the man's momentary blindness to strip the submachine gun from his hands, and then, with cold precision that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with protection, Jian emptied the entire magazine into the mercenary's center mass. The body hit the floor. Silence descended, broken only by the ringing in Jian's ears and Erica's sobbing. Park was still behind the table, his weapon trained on the doorway, waiting for more attackers. But none came. Either they'd killed them all, or the survivors had retreated to regroup. Minho sent killers after a 7-year-old girl. If you're not siding with pure evil, comment, "Protect the innocent" down below. Let's drown out the negativity. Jian turned toward Erica, his vision tunneling, his legs suddenly unreliable. She was pressed against the wall, her grandmother's pajamas covered in plaster dust, her face pale with shock. Maya had emerged behind her, pulling her daughter back, shielding her from the carnage. "I'm sorry," Erica whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry I didn't stay in the bathroom. I'm sorry You saved my life," Jian interrupted. His voice sounded distant, like it was coming from underwater. "You were brave. So brave." His legs gave out. Park was there instantly, catching him before he hit the floor, lowering him carefully against the wall. Jian looked down at his shoulder and saw bone. That wasn't good. That meant the knife had done serious damage. That meant he was probably going into shock. "Boss, stay with me." Park's hands were pressing something against the wound. A towel. A shirt. Jian couldn't tell. "We need to get you to a hospital." "Can't. They'll be watching hospitals." Jian's tongue felt thick, his thoughts fragmenting. Have to get Maya's phone to someone. The evidence. It's the only way to... He didn't finish the sentence because the darkness was rushing in, pulling him under like a riptide. The last thing he saw before consciousness left him was Erica's face, terrified and tear-streaked, and Mrs. Chen calmly instructing Maya to bring clean towels and boiling water. The last thing he heard was his own voice, from what felt like a lifetime ago. "I promise." He'd kept that promise. Erica was alive, Maya was alive, and that would have to be enough, even if he wasn't. Jian woke to pain and the smell of antiseptic. His shoulder was wrapped in fresh bandages, the kind that spoke of careful, competent medical attention. He was still in Mrs. Chen's apartment, lying on the couch with a blanket tucked around him. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting everything in shades of gold that seemed obscene given the violence that had occurred hours earlier. Park sat in the armchair nearby, cleaning his Glock with methodical precision. When he saw Jian's eyes open, he set the weapon aside. "You've been out for 6 hours." "Missus. Chen stitched you up. Said she used to be a nurse before she retired. You're lucky the knife missed the major arteries." "Lucky," Jian repeated, his voice rough. He didn't feel lucky. He felt like he'd been hit by a truck, run over twice for good measure, then set on fire. The mercenaries, dead. All 5 of them. I dragged the bodies to the building's basement before the neighbors woke up. "Mrs. Chen is cleaning the blood from the floor like this is just another Tuesday." Park's expression was grim. "Boss, we can't stay here. Minho knows where we are. He'll send more." Jian knew Park was right. They'd won one battle through sheer desperation and Erica's unexpected courage, but they couldn't win a war of attrition. Minho had unlimited resources, endless manpower, and the backing of Chairman Kang's entire organization. Eventually, the numbers would overwhelm them. We end this today, Jian said, pushing himself upright despite the screaming protest from his shoulder. We give Kang what he wants. The phone? Boss, that evidence is the only leverage we have. Without it, we trade the phone for safe passage. For Maya and Erica. Jian's voice was steady. Final. I call Kang directly. Tell him I'll meet him at the Han River Bridge at sunset. Public enough that he can't just execute us. Isolated enough that we can talk. He gets the phone. We get our lives. Park stared at him like he'd lost his mind. You think Kang will honor that deal? The moment he has the phone, he'll kill all of us. Probably. Jian stood, testing his balance. The room only spun a little. But it's the only play we have left. And maybe, if I can get close enough, I can end him before he ends us. That's not a plan. That's suicide. You have a better option. I'm listening. Park was silent, and his silence was enough to answer. They were out of options, out of allies, out of time. The only path forward was through the fire, and they both knew most of them wouldn't make it out alive. Maya appeared in the doorway. Erica pressed against her side. Both of them looked exhausted, traumatized, but alive. You're going to trade yourself for us, Maya said. It wasn't a question. I'm going to trade the phone for safe passage, Jian corrected. There's a difference. No, there isn't. Maya's eyes were hard, knowing. You're going to walk into a trap so we can escape. You're going to die so my daughter can live. Jian didn't deny it. What was the point? Maya was smart enough to see through any lie he constructed. Your daughter is 7 years old. You're a mother who witnessed a murder. You deserve a chance at life. I'm a criminal who's killed more people than I can count. The math is simple. The math is you've already saved us twice. You don't owe us your life. Maybe I owe it to myself. Jian touched the small braid in his hair, still somehow intact despite the violence. 7 years ago, I stopped being human. I became a thing that moved through the world causing damage. But Erica reminded me that I used to be someone different. Someone who protected instead of destroyed. This is my chance to be that person one last time. Erica stepped forward, her small hand reaching for his uninjured arm. Don't go, please. The bad man will hurt you. The bad man is already hurting people, Jian said gently, kneeling so they were eye to eye. And if I don't stop him, he'll keep hurting people forever. But you're going to be safe. Park is going to take you and your mother somewhere far from Seoul. Somewhere with a beach, maybe. You like beaches? Erica's eyes filled with tears. I don't want you to die. I don't plan to. Jian pulled Maya's phone from his pocket and handed it to Park. But if I do, make sure this gets to Prosecutor Kim at the Seoul Central District. He's honest. He'll use it. The Han River Bridge at sunset was beautiful in a way that made Jian's chest ache. The sky burned orange and pink, reflecting off the water in shades of fire. The bridge stretched across the river like a steel spine, connecting one half of Seoul to the other. Traffic was light at this hour, just a few cars passing by, their occupants oblivious to the drama about to unfold. Chairman Kang stood in the middle of the pedestrian walkway, flanked by a dozen armed men. He looked exactly as Jian remembered from the banquet fat, self-satisfied, dressed in an expensive suit that couldn't hide the corruption underneath. Minho stood beside him, and seeing his former lieutenant there, allied with the enemy, made something cold and hard settle in Jian's stomach. Jian walked forward alone, his hands raised to show he was unarmed. It was a lie he had a knife strapped to his ankle, a small pistol at the small of his back, but the gesture was what mattered. Behind him, Park waited in the Mercedes with Maya, ready to drive away the moment this went bad. Erica had insisted on coming, had thrown a tantrum when they tried to leave her behind, so she walked beside Jian now, her small hand gripping his, her red dress replaced with jeans and a jacket, but her beaded braids still perfect. Jian. Kang's voice boomed across the bridge. The infamous Viper, brought low by a housekeeper and her brat. How the mighty have fallen. I have what you want, Jian called back. The phone, the evidence. You let us walk away, you can destroy it. Walk away? Kang laughed, the sound wet and ugly. You murdered 15 of my men. You started a war. You cost me millions in disrupted operations. And you think I'm going to let you walk away? I think you're a businessman who understands leverage. The phone goes public, you're finished. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison for murdering Minister Cho. But if you let us go, the evidence disappears. You win. Kang's smile widened. I like your logic. There's just one problem. He gestured, and two of his men moved forward. They'd been hiding something behind their group, someone. They dragged her forward, and Jian's blood turned to ice. It was Mrs. Chen, Maya's elderly mother. They had her. We picked her up an hour ago, Minho said, speaking for the first time. His voice was casual, almost friendly. Went back to the apartment after you left. The old woman was still there, cleaning up. Very helpful, actually. Told us exactly where you were going. It was a lie. Mrs. Chen would never betray them. But it didn't matter because they had her, and that changed everything. So here's my counteroffer, Kang continued. You give me the phone. You kneel on this bridge and beg for forgiveness, and then I'll decide who gets to live. Let the women go, Jian said. This is between us. No, this is about teaching Seoul that crossing Chairman Kang has consequences. Kang gestured again, and one of his men grabbed Erica. She screamed, struggling against the grip, her small body thrashing. The man lifted her easily, carrying her to the bridge's railing. It was a long drop to the river below. Survivable. Maybe. If you knew how to fall. Fatal for a 7-year-old child. Here's what's going to happen, Kang said. You're going to kneel. You're going to beg. And if I believe your sincerity, maybe I won't drop the girl. Maybe. Every instinct Jian had screamed to fight, to attack, to use the weapons he'd hidden and die, taking as many of them with him as possible. But Erica was crying, terrified, held over the railing by a man who wouldn't hesitate to release her. Jian looked at Minho, at the man he'd trusted for 4 years. Is this what you wanted? When you betrayed me, was this the future you imagined? Murdering children? Minho's expression flickered guilt, maybe, or just discomfort. You went soft, boss. You chose civilians over the organization. This is what happens when you forget what we are. I know exactly what we are, Jian said quietly. The question is, do you? Then, while every gangster on that bridge watched, while his former lieutenant stood by and did nothing, while Chairman Kang laughed with the confidence of someone who'd already won, Jian did something no one expected. He knelt, not halfway, not reluctantly. He dropped to both knees on the concrete, his injured shoulder screaming in protest, and bowed his head. The Viper, who hadn't shown weakness in 7 years, who'd built an empire on the principle that submission was death, who'd made powerful men tremble with a look knelt in supplication. Kang's laughter died. Minho went pale. Even the armed thugs looked uncomfortable, like they were witnessing something unnatural. Please, Jian said, and his voice carried across the bridge with perfect clarity. Let the child go. She's innocent. This war is between us. I'll give you the phone. I'll give you my life. Just let her go. Kang is laughing because he thinks kindness is weakness. If you want to see that smile wiped off his face, subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's witness his downfall together. For a long moment, nothing happened. The sunset painted everything in shades of blood. The river flowed below, indifferent to human drama. And Jian knelt, waiting. His head bowed, but his muscles coiled like springs. Then Kang spoke, his voice dripping with contempt. You really have gone soft. The legendary Viper. Begging for a child's life. Your brother would be ashamed. And that was the mistake. Mentioning Min Su. Kang had just revealed he knew exactly how to hurt Jian, which meant he'd researched him, which meant this was never about business. It was personal. And personally, Kang wouldn't stop until Jian was dead, which meant Jian had nothing left to lose. Jian's mind was already 3 moves ahead, calculating angles and probabilities with the cold precision that had kept him alive for 7 years. Kang's men were positioned poorly, too confident in their numerical advantage. The one holding Erica was focused on Kang, waiting for orders, not watching his hostage carefully enough. Minho stood slightly apart from the others, his body language uncertain, conflicted, and Kang himself was moving closer, drawn by the spectacle of Jian's submission like a shark to blood. The knife at Jian's ankle felt impossibly far away. The gun at his back might as well have been on the moon. From his kneeling position, injured and apparently broken, he had maybe 2 seconds of surprise before Kang's men filled him with bullets. 2 seconds to save Erica, to end Kang, to prove that kneeling wasn't surrender, it was strategy. But 2 seconds wasn't enough. Not with Erica held over the railing, not with a dozen guns trained on him, not with his shoulder still bleeding through fresh bandages. He needed a miracle. He got Maya instead. The sound came from behind Kang's formation, a woman's scream, raw and primal and full of rage. Every head turned, every weapon swiveled, because Maya Chen was charging up the bridge like an avenging angel. She'd left the Mercedes, despite Park's orders, had somehow circled around behind Kang's group, and now she was running full speed with something in her hands. A tire iron. She must have grabbed it from the car's emergency kit. She wasn't aiming for the armed men. She was aiming for Kang himself, this fat slug who'd ordered her execution, who'd sent killers after her daughter, who represented everything corrupt and poisonous about Seoul's underworld. Her first swing caught one of Kang's bodyguards in the knee. The crack of shattering bone echoed across the bridge. The man went down screaming, "You tried to kill my baby." Maya's voice was savage, inhuman. "You monster. You coward." Chaos erupted. Kang's men spun to deal with this new threat, their training overriding common sense. 3 of them converged on Maya, trying to subdue her without shooting because Kang was in the line of fire. The man holding Erica loosened his grip, his attention divided, trying to understand how a housekeeper had turned into a berserker. It was the opening Jian needed. He moved, not toward Erica, she was too far, and the man still had her. Not toward his weapons, no time to draw them. Instead, Jian launched himself forward in a brutal tackle aimed at Kang's center mass. His wounded shoulder screamed in protest, but pain was just noise, just data, just something to be ignored, in favor of survival. Jian's body collided with Kang's substantial bulk, with enough force to drive them both backward. Kang made a sound like a punctured balloon, all air and surprise. They crashed into the bridge's railing, the metal guardrail digging into Kang's spine. Kang's bodyguards reacted instantly, weapons rising, but they couldn't shoot without hitting their boss. Jian used Kang as a human shield, his hands wrapped around the older man's throat, squeezing with all the strength of someone who'd strangled men in alleyways before he learned to use guns. "Drop her," Jian snarled at the man holding Erica. "Drop her now, or I break his neck." The man hesitated, looking to Minho for orders. Minho stood frozen, his weapon half raised, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror at what he'd helped create. "Minho." Jian's voice cut through the chaos. "You want to be a boss? Then make a boss decision. Is this who you want to be? The man who kills children? The man who sides with monsters?" For a heartbeat, the bridge held its breath. Maya was still struggling against 2 of Kang's men, the tire iron gone, but her nails drawing blood. Mrs. Chen had somehow freed herself in the confusion and was stumbling toward the Mercedes. Erica hung over the railing, crying but not giving up, her small hands gripping the man's arm with desperate strength. And Jian knelt with his hands around Kang's throat, waiting for his former lieutenant to choose what kind of man he wanted to be. Minho lowered his weapon. "Let the girl go," he said quietly. "What?" The man holding Erica looked shocked. But boss said, "I'm the boss now." Minho's voice was harder this time. "And I said let her go." The man released Erica. She didn't fall gracefully, children don't. She hit the walkway hard, skinning her palms, her beads clicking against concrete. But she was alive, and she immediately scrambled away from the railing, running toward where Park had emerged from the Mercedes with his weapon drawn. Kang tried to speak around Jian's grip, his face turning purple. You're dead." "Maybe," Jian agreed, "but you're dying first." He felt Kang's hands scrabbling at his arms, weak and desperate, felt the older man's pulse fluttering under his fingers like a trapped bird. It would be easy to finish it, to squeeze until that pulse stopped, to end the threat permanently. 7 years ago, Jian wouldn't have hesitated. 7 years ago, he would have killed Kang and everyone on this bridge without a second thought. But 7 years ago, He hadn't knelt to save a child. Hadn't learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose mercy when violence would be easier. Jian released Kang's throat and shoved him backward. Hard. Kang stumbled, his expensive shoes slipping on the concrete made slick with blood from the earlier scuffle. His arms windmilled, grasping for the railing, for his men, for anything that would stop his momentum. But gravity was patient and impartial. His bulk worked against him, pulling him backward toward the gap in the railing that safety inspectors had marked for repair weeks ago. He fell. Not gracefully, not quietly. Chairman Kang fell the way men like him always fall, screaming denials and threats that the wind swallowed before they reached anyone's ears. The drop was 15 meters to the Han River below. The water was shallow this time of year, less than 2 meters deep over concrete and rocks. The sound of impact carried across the water like thunder. Kang's men rushed to the railing, staring down at where their boss floated face down in the river, his expensive suit spreading around him like dark wings. No one moved to help him. No one jumped in. They just stared. These career criminals realizing that their meal ticket had just expired. If you're glad that greed and corruption finally got what they deserved, hit that like button one last time. Let's show the world that good eventually wins. Maya broke free from her captors and ran to where Erica huddled near Park. Mother and daughter collided in a tangle of arms and sobs and whispered reassurances. Mrs. Chen reached them seconds later, her elderly arms wrapping around both of them, creating a barrier of family that felt more solid than any armor. Jian stood at the railing, his injured shoulder bleeding freely now, his body running on fumes and stubbornness. He looked down at Kang's body still floating, still not moving, and felt nothing. No triumph, no regret, just a bone-deep exhaustion that made his legs shake. Minho approached slowly, his weapon holstered, his hands visible. Boss, don't. Jian's voice was flat. You don't get to call me that anymore. I know. Minho's face twisted with something that might have been shameful. I wanted power. Respect. I thought you'd gone soft, that you were weak for caring about people. But watching you kneel for that child, watching you choose her life over your pride that took more strength than anything I've ever done. You're right about one thing. I did go soft. Jian turned to face his former lieutenant, and his eyes held no warmth, no forgiveness. But soft doesn't mean weak. It means I finally remembered what's worth fighting for. He pulled Maya's phone from his pocket and tossed it to Minho, who caught it reflexively. The evidence of Minister Cho's murder. You have two choices. Take it to Prosecutor Kim, and maybe you can salvage something decent from the wreckage you helped create. Or destroy it, and keep building your empire on corpses and corruption. But know this, if I ever hear you've hurt innocents again, if I ever hear you've targeted civilians, I will come back. And next time, I won't kneel. Minho stared at the phone like it was a live grenade. Around them, Kang's men were beginning to disperse, smart enough to realize that their organization had just collapsed, and the smart move was to disappear before the police arrived. Already, Jian could hear sirens in the distance. Someone had called about the gunfire, about the body in the river. What about you? Minho asked. The Gomga Syndicate. Is yours, or Jung's, or whoever wants it. Ji-an was already walking toward the Mercedes, toward Maya and Erica and Mrs. Chen. I'm done building empires. He made it 3 steps before his legs gave out. Park was there to catch him, lowering him carefully to sit against the railing. Jian's vision was graying at the edges, his body finally acknowledging that it had been pushed beyond its limits. Boss, you need a hospital. Can't. Police will be here soon. Need to disappear. Then where? Jian looked at Maya, at this woman who'd charged armed men with a tire iron to create a distraction. At Erica, who'd screamed to save his life. At Mrs. Chen, who'd stitched his wounds without asking questions. At this small, fierce family who'd somehow become worth more than his entire empire. Somewhere with a beach, he said, remembering his promise to Erica. Somewhere far from Seoul. Somewhere we can all pretend to be normal for a while. Erica broke away from her mother and ran to him, her small hands cupping his face. You kept your promise. Again. 3 times. 3 times? You promised to save Mama. You did. You promised to protect me. You did. And you promised you wouldn't die. Her smile was wobbly but real. You kept all of them. Jian's hand touched the small braid in his hair, still somehow intact through everything. I guess I did. The sirens were getting closer. Park helped Jian to his feet, supporting most of his weight. Behind them, Minho still stood at the railing, holding the phone, watching his former boss limp toward the Mercedes. Jian, Minho called. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Jian didn't turn around. Sorry doesn't fix what's broken. But it's a start. They drove away as the first police cars arrived, as Minho made his decision about the evidence. As Chairman Kang's body was pulled from the Han River and pronounced dead on arrival, they drove through Seoul's neon streets one last time, past the Grand Seoul Hotel where this had all started, past the territories Jian had once ruled with an iron fist. And none of it felt like losing. It felt like finally, after 7 years of being frozen, Jian was beginning to thaw. 3 weeks later, Jian sat on a beach in Busan, watching the sun paint the East Sea in shades of amber and rose. His shoulder was healing, the stitches finally removed, leaving a scar that would match the dozens of others that mapped his violent history. The small braid in his hair had long since come undone, but he'd asked Erica to redo it every few days. A reminder, he told himself, of what mattered. The news had broken 2 days after the bridge. Prosecutor Kim Honest, relentless, incorruptible, had held a press conference displaying the evidence that Minho had delivered. The video of Minister Cho's murder was grainy but damning. Chairman Kang's voice was unmistakable as he'd ordered the execution. The subsequent investigation had moved with unusual speed, fueled by political pressure and public outrage. 19 members of the Myeongdong faction were arrested within a week. The organization that Kang had built over 2 decades crumbled in days, its leadership scattered, its power structures demolished. The police found bodies in basements, evidence of trafficking operations, documentation of bribes to politicians and judges. It was the kind of comprehensive collapse that only happened when corruption finally met consequences. Minho had disappeared. Some said he'd fled to Thailand. Others claimed he'd made a deal with prosecutors and entered witness protection. Jian didn't know and found he didn't care. His former lieutenant had made his choice and had delivered the evidence instead of destroying it. Whether that was redemption or just pragmatism, Jian would probably never know. The Gumga syndicate had fractured without Jian's leadership. Young had tried to hold it together, to maintain the territories and the business operations. But without the Viper's reputation backing him, the other factions had moved in like sharks. The empire Jian had spent 7 years building had lasted less than 3 weeks after his departure, and he felt nothing but relief. Park appeared from the beach house they'd rented, carrying 2 bottles of beer and wearing swim trunks that looked absurd on his tactical frame. He settled into the sand beside Jian and handed him one of the bottles. Mrs. Chen is teaching Erica to make kimchi, Park reported. The kitchen is a disaster. Maya is pretending to supervise but mostly laughing. Sounds normal, Jian said. Sounds like family, Park corrected. He took a long drink of beer, his eyes on the horizon. Jung called again. The Jumga territories are falling apart. He wants to know if you're coming back. What did you tell him? That you died on the bridge, that your body washed up 3 days later, that he's on his own. Jian nodded. It was better that way, cleaner. The Viper was dead. Kang Jian, the version who'd spent 7 years frozen in grief and violence, had drowned in the Han River along with Chairman Kang. What remained was something newer, something that was still figuring out how to exist without empire or reputation or fear. You miss it? Park asked. The power, the respect, the empire. Jian watched a child, not Erica, some other family's daughter, building a sandcastle near the water's edge. Her father crouched beside her, helping place shells as decoration, and their laughter carried across the beach like music. I miss Min-soo, Jian said quietly. I miss the person I was before he died. But the empire, the violence, the constant calculation of who to trust and who to eliminate. He shook his head. That was never living. That was just surviving with expensive clothes. So what now? We stay here forever? Play house with a housekeeper and her family? Maya's not just a housekeeper. Jian's voice carried an edge of warning. She's got a degree in logistics management. Spent 3 years at Seoul National University before her husband died, and she had to drop out to support Erica. She was cleaning hotel rooms because it paid the bills, not because it was all she could do. Park raised his hands in surrender. I meant no disrespect. I just mean, what's the long-term plan? Jian had been thinking about that question for 3 weeks. In the hours between physical therapy for his shoulder and helping Erica with her homework, between teaching Mrs. Chen how to use her new smartphone and learning from Maya how to cook something more sophisticated than instant ramyeon, in the quiet moments when he wasn't running from enemies or building empires or calculating threats. I have money, he said. Offshore accounts that Minho doesn't know about. Investments that are legitimate or legitimate enough. More than enough to buy a restaurant, maybe. Or a hotel. Something legal. Something that doesn't require carrying a gun or checking my car for explosives. A restaurant, Park repeated flatly. You're going to go from crime lord to restaurant owner. Why not? I know the hospitality industry. I've been extorting it for years. Jian's smile was small but genuine. And Erica wants to be a chef. She's been talking about it constantly. Says she wants to make food that makes people happy instead of just feeding them. I figure maybe I could help with that. You're actually serious. I knelt on a bridge to save a child's life. I gave up an empire for a housekeeper and her daughter. I think we're past the point where anything I do should surprise you. Park was quiet for a long moment, watching the waves roll in with hypnotic regularity. What about me? Where do I fit in this new life? Jian turned to look at his bodyguard, this man who'd followed him through gunfights and political intrigue and the complete collapse of everything they'd built. You're the best security consultant I know, and restaurants need security. Plus, someone has to keep me from making stupid business decisions. Security consultant. Park laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. My mother always wanted me to have a respectable job. Erica burst from the beach house, her braids flying, wearing a sundress covered in flour and what looked like gochugaru. She ran straight to Jian and climbed into his lap despite being covered in cooking ingredients. Jian, Grandma says I'm a natural. She says I have an intuitive understanding of fermentation. Her excitement was infectious, radiating from her like heat from the sun. When I grow up, I'm going to have the best restaurant in all of Korea. And you have to come eat there every day. Promise? I promise, Jian said, meaning it the way he'd meant all the promises he'd made to her. Completely. Irrevocably. And you have to teach me business stuff. Mama says you're really smart about business. Is that true? Some kinds of business. The legal kinds I'm still learning. Then we'll learn together. Erica's logic was unassailable. Mama's teaching me cooking. Grandma's teaching me Korean traditions. Park's teaching me chess. You can teach me business. Then I'll know everything. Maya appeared at the beach house door, her hands covered in flour, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked nothing like the terrified woman who'd been tied to a prep table 3 weeks ago. She looked strong, alive, and present. Erica, stop bothering Jian. He's recovering. I'm not bothering him. We're making plans. Plans for what? Maya descended the steps, settling into the sand beside them with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd stopped seeing Jian as the Viper and started seeing him as just a man. Jian's going to help me open a restaurant someday, Erica announced with the confidence of someone who'd never been told their dreams were too big. And it's going to be amazing. Maya's eyes met Jian's over her daughter's head. In them, he saw understanding, gratitude, and something else possibility. Not romance, not yet, maybe never, but the possibility of building something together, of creating a life that wasn't defined by violence or survival but by choice. I was thinking, Maya said carefully, that maybe I could go back to school, finish my degree. My mother says she can watch Erica while I take evening classes, and with the reward money from the prosecutor's office for providing evidence. She trailed off, uncertain. How much did they give you? Jian asked. 50 million won, for helping to break up a criminal organization. Maya's laugh was bitter. I got paid for almost dying. That won't cover tuition and living expenses for 4 years. Jian pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. I'm setting up an account in your name. Education fund. 100 million won to start. You finish your degree, get whatever certifications you need, and when you're done, If you want to work in legitimate logistics, I'll need someone who understands supply chains for the restaurant. Maya stared at him like he'd grown a second head. That's too much. I can't accept. Yes, you can. Call it payment for your silence about who I used to be. Call it an investment in Erica's future. Call it whatever you need to call it to accept the help. Jian's voice was gentle but firm. You saved my life, Maya. Multiple times. This is the least I can do. The least you can do is stay alive and be happy, Maya said quietly. That's all Erica and I want. For you to have the life your brother would have wanted for you. Mrs. Chen called from the house that dinner was ready, her voice carrying across the beach with the authority of grandmothers everywhere. Erica jumped up immediately, always ready to eat, and ran toward the promise of food. Park followed more slowly, his hand unconsciously checking for a weapon that wasn't there anymore. Maya stood and offered Jian her hand. He took it, letting her help pull him to his feet. His shoulder twinged but held. Everything was healing, slowly, the way all real healing happened. Thank you, Maya said. For everything. For saving us. For giving us a future. You gave me a future, Jian corrected. I was just going through the motions before, existing but not living. Erica reminded me there was a difference. They walked toward the beach house together, toward the sound of laughter and the smell of home-cooked food and the promise of a tomorrow that wasn't about survival but about actually living. Jian's hand unconsciously touched the small braid in his hair, and he found himself smiling. The Viper was dead, Chairman Kang was dead, the Empire was dust, and Kang Jian, just a man with a violent past and an uncertain future, was finally, impossibly, beautifully alive. Behind them, the sun finished setting over the East Sea, painting the sky in colors that promised tomorrow would come, as inevitable and forgiving as the tide.